Let's not try too hard. Yeah. We're good?
You should be.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your patience as we get the technology right. So happy to have you with us for our February Sunday evening lecture that features George McDaniel, a historian at South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, also a member at Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in Somerville, as well as Ashley Walters, director of the Pearlstein Lipoff Center for the Study of Southern Jewish Culture. And tonight they'll discuss the significance of Richard Lushington, his Quaker roots, his connection to Jewish history through his unique militia unit, and the world of revolutionary Charlestown, which brought them all together. Thank you so very much for being here. And for all of you, please join us for a reception in Stevens Hall following this event, which is to the left of our office space. Turn left into the courtyard and follow that way. It's a lovely reception we have prepared for you. So without further ado, George and Ashley.
Good afternoon. Thank you all. So we're going to do a couple things. I'm going to go quickly just through sort of a general context of like who this is and why it's significant, and sort of his life. And then I'm going to sit down with my friend and colleague Ashley Walters, and we're going to have a little conversation and dive a little more in depth. So Lushington Lost and Found, Charleston's lost Quaker commander comes home. And Ashley's going to be my slide. So we're going to start just the quick nuts and bolts of the life of Richard Lushington. So he's born in 1751 in Charlestown. Charlestown becomes Charleston following the Revolutionary War. But born in 1751 to English Quaker parents. So he's a first-generation Charlestonian born to English immigrants. Charlestown, this is a map of Charlestown in 1739, and unfortunately you can't see it, but there's just to sort of highlight the geography of this landscape of colonial Charlestown. You have here the Anglican Church, which of course is St. Philip's, is still in the same location, the French Huguenot Church, and then if you were to see outside the walls and sort of up above, up there in the screen, is the Quaker Meeting House. And Quakers were some of the first ones to come here, but it was a very small population. Next. So quickly on Quakers. So it was a small population. Benjamin Karp, who's a wonderful historian, has this line that the culture of Charlestown was officially tolerant but culturally hostile. I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with the fundamental constitutions. South Carolina, that were written by John Locke. South Carolina was relatively liberal in the colonial era, and wanted to accept people from all various religions, including Jews, Quakers, Protestants. The only really exception was Catholics. They didn't want Catholics coming. But this officially tolerant but culturally hostile, we'll sort of explore that. So one of the things that Lushington, that I've found in my work, is that Lushington really sought prominence. He was sort of an insider in that he was born in Charleston, was of Charleston, but as a Quaker was kind of outside. And outside of the closed circle of high society. But he works his life, and one of the things, sort of the driving things of his life is to gain acceptance into the society. And he becomes a prominent merchant, and of course Charlestown was a large port city, one of the crowns of the British Empire, if you will, in the Atlantic world. Next. So in 1774, he marries Charity Ball, who's a widow of William Ball, who was of that Ball family, the slaves in the family, that very prominent Ball family. And so we see in marrying her, Lushington is sort of moving up through the society to marry the widow of such a prominent family. Here's an advertisement for 8 lots on Hazel Street, running down, right down through Ansonboro, just a few blocks from where we are. Lushington winds up buying one of these. We don't know if this was the advertisement that he saw in the paper, but he bought a lot right down there near the corner of Hazel and East Bay Street. So here it is, and on that estate, he established a distillery, which is fantastic for a guy named Lushington, right? And so here's his distillery, located right there along Hazel Street, which of course is just a couple of blocks away from here, just, hop, skip, and a jump, just right over there. So next. So Captain Richard Lushington, he is appointed as an officer in the militia when the Revolutionary War begins in earnest. And that, again, it shows sort of his elevation in society, because officers, it was kind of a social status thing. It wasn't necessarily working your way up through the ranks. So Richard Lushington's district extended from Boundary Street, which is Calhoun, down King Street to Broad. And then, as now, that was largely mercantile in nature. And as a result, there were lots of Jewish merchants who had shops along King Street and then lived above the shops. And so when you mustered as a militia unit, you mustered by your address. And so given that district, Lushington's unit wound up with a significant portion of Jewish men serving in his militia. Here we have, this is from an archive in New York, and it's dated November 78 and then 79, Richard Lushington. And the thing to really highlight here is it's a regiment in Charleston called the Free Citizens. And that whole idea of sort of these Jewish men also sort of seeking, sort of acceptance in this Charleston society. And the calling it the Free Citizens is a significant point in that step. Next. So just some quick major engagements there in the Battle of Port Royal, the Siege of Savannah, and then of course here in the Siege of Charleston in March to May of 1780. So they're militia units, so they're keeping it sort of local and moving around. They're not traveling like the Continental Army is doing, but they're involved. And of course, during the Siege of Charleston, you have this interesting, sort of crashing together of civilian and military as Charleston was besieged for about 6 weeks. Next. Here's a list that was made by one of the men who served under Lushington, a gentleman named Jacob Cohen. And if you can't read it, it's the enumeration of the names of Israelites who served in one company garrisoned at Charleston in 1779 under Captain Lushington. And some of the names, we have Cohen, Samuel Abrams, Ephraim Adams, Joseph Solomon, and then down here is a newspaper report from March of 1779, giving an account of the wounded and the KIAs at the Battle of Port Royal. And we see that a gentleman, Joseph Solomon, was killed, and then Ephraim Abrams, they have Adams here, but was wounded. And that's reflected in this account over here. The interesting thing, though, is that this is largely correct, it was recounted by Jacob Cohen in 1822 when he was about 82 years old and about 42 years after the events take place. So that's sort of that thing of when you're a historian, you're looking at the source, but then also wondering, well, how accurate can we be? So you've got to find multiple sources and put the picture together. Next. So quickly moving along, Lushington, following the war, seems to have gained some acceptance and begins to move in these high society circles. He serves in the South Carolina General Assembly. He serves as a warden, which is like city councilman. Even before the war, he's joined the Fellowship Society, and then during the war became a member of the South Carolina Society and a member of the Charleston Library Society, which is, of course, still going just up King Street from here. Yep. So the Jewish people as well gained prominence coming out of the war, and were establishing themselves. Over here to the left, this is the original Kahal Kadash Beth Elohim synagogue that was built in the 1780s. This was a drawing of it from the 1790s. And then, of course, we all recognize St. Michael's over here. And we'll explore this a little bit more, but I just wanted to sort of point out that this, we had this reflection of Jewish and Episcopalian, well, Anglican then, and then.
So the synagogue originally was not in its location right now?
No, it was, well, yes, it was. That one
burned in the fire of 1830.
Yes, it did.
And only the ironwork survived.
Yes.
That's what happened.
Yep. Yes, it was on Hazel Street as a.
The current.
Yes. Yeah. Next one. So then, June 1790, Richard Lushington passes away from typhus. He falls sick on Friday, and by Sunday afternoon, he is dead. And interestingly enough, and this is just one of those things how it works. Typhus was one of the leading killers in concentration camps, and it's a flea and tick biting insect disease that's passed, and then is a fever kind of that leads to death. And it's actually Anne Frank passed away from typhus, and so this idea that all these years later this gentleman who commanded these Jewish men, and then the typhus was in the Holocaust. I think it's just kind of one of those little history rhyming things. Next. So after he passes away, he has in his will, "Do cause me to be buried without ceremony." Quakers very different than Episcopalians and other Protestants. That's fine. We can. So what you would see is the Quaker meeting house was right over there at Queen and King Street. And in the fire of 1837, the Quaker meeting house, which by that point Quakers had left largely. There it is again. Look at that. Hey yo. Quakers had largely left by the beginning of the 19th century, in large part due to their opposition to slavery. But they also were not a very big population to begin with. But they're completely gone by then, and the Quaker meeting house is, quote, exploded. In fact, if we go to the next slide, we can historical erasure. Okay, we can go one more. Yep, we can go through. So you can see here the Quaker meeting house which was blown up, and then and so the meeting house is destroyed, and then the cemetery was still remaining until the late 1960s. Yes, it was a fire break. And this is the fire of 1838, which also burns Lushington's estate, his house, and most of Ansonboro. And the KKBE synagogue, which is listed here. This is a list of buildings destroyed during that fire. And we see along Hazel Street, of course, the synagogue, and then there's other Jewish names of homes destroyed as well.
What was the date again of that fire?
So this one was 1838, and then there was a fire before in 1837 as well. There were lots of fires there.
2 years old?
Yeah. Okay. So if you go wander around Ansonboro, you will see lots of historic homes and buildings. But if you look closely on the Signature Preservation Society plaques, You'll notice that in the Ansonboro, that area, they're all like circa 1841, 42, and they're following the fires of 1837 and 38. Next. So Lushington has been, the Quakers meeting house is gone. Quakers are largely gone. But the Jewish presence remains strong, and it still remains strong to this day. We still have KKBE, one of the oldest synagogues, and then, of course, this historical marker that just went up to mark Little Jerusalem on Upper King Street. And so where they had been down on that sort of lower end of King Street, it just sort of moved up as the years went on, but still present. Here's the Cumming Street Cemetery, which is the Kahal Kadash Beth Elohim Cemetery. Notice the tombstones and markers, very reminiscent of a church cemetery, and sort of just very mimicking like the architecture of the synagogue and St. Michael's with the gravestones as well. This is Mark's Lazarus, who is Sergeant Major. Next. So in the late 60s, it says the crews finished relocating Quaker cemetery graves. So right there at King and Queen, as I said, the meeting house was gone, but the cemetery remained, and they exhumed remains of wound up being about 14 people, but that was all that was moved. There were certainly many more buried there. But they're moved right over here behind the county courthouse, right there at the Four Corners of Law, right across from the South Carolina Historical Society fireproof building. Next. And in its place, the big Charleston County parking garage. So, I mean, literally paved paradise and put up a parking lot, right? So here you can see the little marker for the Quaker cemetery and some of the original ironwork that was still there. Could have had a little bit of a different outcome. The Preservation Society in the late 60s had a push to preserve the cemetery, and in fact had down here a sketch even done by Latrell Briggs, whom I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with, who designed a garden that could have gone in that place. But instead, we got that brutalist architecture of the parking lot. And so quickly, recovery of Richard Lushington. When I started out, we didn't know much about him. There was even thought that he might have been Jewish. But I went to work and found, actually we go right on next, quickly. The Gibbs Museum in 1936 had an exhibition on miniatures, and two of those miniatures were lent by the Mrs. Omler of Savannah. And so we had a black and white photograph from the 1930s of Richard Lushington on the left and then his wife Charity on the right. But that was all we had to go on. The Gibbs had no records aside from that. And so that was what I had to go on, just lent by the Mrs. Omler of Savannah. Next. But a little digging and lots of dead ends, and found that the Mrs. Omler were these two ladies that lived on Wilmington Island, which is just outside of Savannah. If you're going from Savannah out to Tybee along that big causeway, Wilmington is one of the little barrier islands just off. And so there was a Facebook group, History of Wilmington Island, Georgia, which I joined, and then wrote a post explaining who I was, what I was doing, and put the pictures that I had from the Gibbs in 1936. And within 10 minutes, I got a reply from a woman that said, I have them, and she contacted me. And it turns out it was her great aunts who were the two Mrs. Omler, and they had passed them down to her mother, and then from her mother to her. And so I went, and this is she and her sister, and so Faye McDonald and Elizabeth Adams. And there's Elizabeth Adams. They didn't know who it was. It turned out it was one miniature. On one side was Richard, and on the other side was Charity, and they had no idea who they were. She had even taken them to an Antiques Roadshow, and they couldn't tell her. They just said it looked like a Revolutionary War officer, but could tell her no more. And so she was thrilled to find out a bit more about him. And since they had not known who he was, she wanted to return him to Charleston, and so asked me where they might go. And so he is returned to Charleston Library Society, of which he was a member. So this is Doug Bostic, who was our CEO, who passed away recently, back in October, and then Laura Mina, who's the head librarian, and of course myself, on the day we returned Richard Lushington to Charleston Library Society. And so here he is. He's on display. If you go into the Library Society, they had their 18th century section, and he's on display. And the really cool thing is that they have their original minutes for their journal of the Library Society, and they have it turned to the page from 1780 when he was accepted as a member to the Library Society. And so he's sitting there right next to his name in the book, which is pretty cool. So, and quickly, new ways to explore history with Battleground Trust. This is a little fun thing. I've been working with the American Jewish Military Historical Society, and they are publishing a comic book because they want to get kids and younger generations excited about history. And so I've been working with him to sort of talk about my work and the Jewish men. And as a favor, I asked if I could be in the comic book. So that is me with my arm extended in a British officer's uniform, telling my men to charge forward during the siege of Charleston, and going up against apparently the Lushington and his Jewish militia. So it's a fun little thing. So quickly, just some other work that we're doing. I'm sure y'all are familiar with this, the piece, the hunk of tabby that's at the Hornwork on Marion Square. We've just done some work with the Liberty Trail, and if we go to the next. So we're working with a British company, irony of ironies, right? To create this sort of augmented reality. So this is a still photo showing how the Hornwork would have been, because it would have spanned across multiple blocks from King and that whole area. And so this is part of it. Next. And then we have in Marion Square, if you go, there are these markers that are now laid on the ground that mark out that section, the footprint of that section of the Hornwork. So you can kind of walk, and you can see why it's called the Hornwork, because it's got these sort of horns that were bastions at the points. And one more. Okay, so with this British company, we've developed an augmented reality, and this is an app that it will be coming to the Hornwork. You will be able to do this at the Hornwork soon. This is from Fort Watson. I think if you just hit next, it'll play this little video screen over here. Yeah. So this is in my office, and you can see you can select it. And there's sounds of gunfire and such, and then you can hold your phone and try and get oriented, but you can see the fort and the fire and the all manner of things. And it's really, and this will be at the Hornwork. You'll scan a QR code, and that augmented reality of the showing the Hornwork will be on your phone, and you can do it. And they're also doing those old binoculars that that you put the quarter in. It's going to be free, but you just look through them, and we'll have the Hornwork laid out. So now I'm going to bring my friend Ashley, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth.
good place to begin would be to think about the world that Lushington occupied, that his men occupied, because we have an image of what Charleston looked like, right? And I think that image probably is more 19th century, maybe pre-Civil War Charleston. So I'd love to hear what George could share regarding what Lushington's Charleston would have looked like.
Yeah, so I think you're right, and I think a lot of people, when they come to Charleston, visitors, they think of the Old South and sort of this antebellum vision. But Charleston in the 18th century was a very different world. It was polyglot. Anyone know what polyglot means? Yeah, so many tongued, and if you think about it, like it was, as I said, it was a major port city in this vast British Empire and this much larger Atlantic world. And so just in Charleston, or Charlestown, you would have had, of course, English, but then French from the French Huguenots, German and Dutch, along with Spanish and Portuguese, because you do have these Sephardic Jews coming from the Iberian Peninsula. And that's not even to begin to mention all of the African languages that would have been spoken by the enslaved who were brought over into this port. So walking along East Bay Street and those wharfs in the 18th century, 1780s and 70s and Lushington's time would have just been a real sort of onslaught of the senses of all of these things going on. And then it's in the 19th century, as I said, Quakers leave. And of course, we know that the Grimke sisters of Charleston go to Pennsylvania because that's where the Quakers are. And one of the reasons is because once we get into the 19th century, slavery really becomes a divider. Either you are with it and stay in Charleston, or if you're not, then you go elsewhere. And so it becomes a little more sort of homogenized in that sense than it was in the 18th century.
Yeah, so on that note, I work on one minority group living within Charleston, and so I'd love to hear your take on the story for Quakers. But in Jewish history, we frequently talk about how military service is a way for Jews, frequently who are new arrivals to the country, new immigrants, articulating a sense of belonging and a sense of Americanness. And so I'd be curious if the same is true for Quakers, and if you think kind of taking this post in the Revolutionary War would have been something that Lushington was trying to do, articulate his Americanness.
Yes, I think, and we certainly, you saw that with the free citizens, right, and with Jews serving in the military. And I do think it was the same for Lushington. Quakers in the Yamasee War had maintained their pacifism and had experienced harsh backlash as a result of that. So I think that was sort of in the consciousness and something that Lushington might have considered when it came time to potentially take up arms in the Revolution. And I will also say that the Quakers in Charleston said they're small minority, and they also, because they are physically separated by a great distance from Pennsylvania, which is sort of where the Quaker center in the American colonies, that distance sort of allowed them a bit more freedom with their Quakerness or lack thereof. In fact, there's an interesting letter that's written by a Quaker woman who comes down to Charleston and writes a letter admonishing Charleston Quakers as sort of this hedonistic and like how could you you can't really call yourself Quakers the way that you're living, and so I think Lushington is doing that, but and again trying to sort of gain this acceptance into society. And of course, one of the ways in the Revolutionary War, many prominent Charlestonians were fighting on the patriot cause, and Lushington is among those of about 36 initially who were arrested and then sent to St. Augustine and exiled to St. Augustine, including Christopher Gadsden, Edward Rutledge, Alexander Moultrie, so some big names. And then Lushington was right there along with them. Unfortunately, we don't have any journals or diaries that Lushington writing, saying, this is why I did it. So it's all sort of piecing together the clues. But given his upward mobility and status, it seems that was certainly a part of it. And joining the military and serving as an officer was a way to do that. Absolutely.
Great. I think visitors from outside of I think Jews coming to Charleston from outside of the city would have had the same complaint about Charleston's Jews and kind of their level of religiosity, for sure. So you started to talk a bit about the military history, what actually transpired during the Revolutionary War in Charleston. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the siege of Charleston, especially the building of the hornwork. And then you also mentioned Captain Lushington and maybe a few of his men were arrested and sent elsewhere after Charleston falls. Could you tell us about that story?
So the hornwork, construction begins earlier than the Revolution, but when the Revolution begins, they sort of start to rush to complete it. Because they know that Charleston, the British will come for Charleston, and they came, of course, in 1776, and Moultrie turned them away. But then they do return in 1780 and lay siege to the city. And Lincoln, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, is the commander here, and he really is of the belief and understanding that he is not to let Charleston fall because it is such a key port city, and so he holds out for quite some time, but no relief comes. And you do see with this, as I said, this sort of collision of military and civilian that we don't see in America anymore, because wars are always fought over there, elsewhere. But there's even a house on King Street that has a cannonball in it, where a cannon fire came in from the third floor, crashed through the support beams all the way down, and embedded in the fireplace down in the cellar. And it was only discovered in the 1960s when they did a complete renovation. It's the Edgar Wells house. If anyone down there wants to see the house, and they found the cannonball, and now they've moved it up to the first floor living room. I was speaking at Charleston Library Society, and the woman said, "Hey, that's my house. You can." And they have a little cabinet window that you open up, and there's the cannonball with the broken beam. So you can see sort of this remnant of this collision of military and civilian. And Lushington is among a large group of militia commanders who ultimately write to Lincoln and pressure him to surrender the city, saying that we've had enough. This is not going to get any better. And then Lincoln surrenders the city, and the Continentals leave. And in the Revolutionary War, what you would do is what was called parole. So the officers essentially swear an oath that I will not fight against the British anymore. and then you're allowed to go about your life. Others are who may not swear an oath, or were not necessarily officers and of that status, were put out on prison ships in the harbor, which was a whole different kind of horror. But Lushington and these 36 men are arrested in late August, and so a few months after the city falls, and are exiled to St. Augustine, Florida. And while that, certainly is in the 18th century, that's a long way to go, and you're being taken away from your family and all of that. They were not necessarily suffering. They were allowed some were even allowed to bring their own enslaved with them, which gives there's an interesting paper in there on like this double enslavement of these men and potentially women too, who were brought and were enslaved to people who were prisoners of war as well. But they're allowed to rent a villa. Rent villas. Lushington is one of 12 who rent a villa that has it's described as piazzas all through the house, and an orange grove in the yard, and so they're allowed to move about the city. So it's a very different sort of fate than those who were sentenced to the prison ships. So while exile, no doubt, a bit more luxurious exile, if you will.
So there were two Revolutionary War militias that here in Charleston that had a sizable Jewish presence. One was Lushington, the other was led by an Anglican, James Bentham. Have you been able to find anything about Bentham and the militia he commanded?
So Bentham is an interesting story. Found a little bit about him. So he is sent. He's English and is sent at about 13 years old by his parents to Charlestown to apprentice in some mercantile. I can't recall it right off the top of my head, but works as an apprentice, and then is an officer. And has some Jewish men in his militia unit, but he's actually buried at St. Philip's in the cemetery, and so he has this sort of different fate than Lushington, where Lushington is of Charlestown, born here, lived here, died here, and so is of it, but is an outsider as well, as a Quaker, and sort of this small minority, whereas Bentham, who comes from England, is not of Charleston, but is sort of more of it in a social sense, in that he's a member of St. Philip's and is the Anglican church, and then is buried in St. Philip's Cemetery, which, as we know, has never been threatened with demolition or being paved over to put up a parking lot. So a bit different, ending for him.
And I'll ask one final question, then I'll see if there's questions from the audience. But I'm curious about charity. So this woman on the other side of the miniature, have you been able to find out anything about charity?
So charity is a tragic sort of story. She marries this William Bull, who's deceased, and we don't know. It seems kind of like they were married young, and something, it was the 18th century. Something, he fell ill and passed away. Then she marries Richard Lushington, who they're married for about 16 years, from 1774 till he passes away in 1790. And then following that, just a couple years later, she marries a gentleman named George Forrest. And I will, of course his name is George, and he turns out to be just a scoundrel. So they marry in 1794. And then in 1795, just or 1795 or 6, just 1 or 2 years later, he goes to the bank and withdraws all of their funds and assets and absconds into the never. That we completely lose track of him. So Charity is left destitute, but it is through her that we are able to have the miniature, because her sister was married to this gentleman Daniel Latham, who it was related to the Omlers down the line, and so that's where the line comes. And it's Daniel Latham. If you go to the little Quaker marker behind the county courthouse, you'll see there's one stone laid on the grass, and that's Daniel Latham. He was the only one who had a marker for his grave, so they moved that from the Quaker cemetery as well to mark the location of those buried there. And he was a partner with Lushington in their distillery and such. They were brothers-in-law and such. But yeah, so Charity, there's another interesting paper for any women scholars out there that here she is, this 18th century woman who thrice married, and then the third husband was really just a scoundrel, and left her destitute. But then she's picked up by her sister and brother-in-law, and sort of carried and supported through them. And she and Richard did not have any children, so there's no line coming down from that.
Should we open it to the audience?
So was Lushington in good standing with the Quakers? Because I've seen documents where you marry outside of the church, or you go to war and you're out.
Yeah, so we have records from the Quaker meetings up in Pennsylvania where he is mentioned and is documented. So he's in good standing there. Again, I think it's this sort of liminal space with him existing outside of being in Charlestown. They didn't have so much control. And in fact, the Charlestown meeting, by the late 18th century and then even into the early 19th century, was so weak that it was answered there's a Bush River meeting up inland of South Carolina, and they sort of oversaw it. But as far as we know, Lushington remained in good standing until his death that we know of, and yeah. But there's not. I haven't found anything where he was excommunicated or yeah. Yeah.
So you said that his parents came from England, right? So did they actually come, because John's Island was the Quaker settlement, did they come from that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they came to. Yeah, and that might be it. And there's that might well be it. I know that they came from Kent, and Lushington in his will he mentions that there's a sister that is still in England, or has gone back, and so but I don't know where his parents immigrated to in Charleston, but they might have, and of course, and then in the crisp map 1711, they have the Quaker meeting house is just outside of the fortifications of the old walled city, so.
Actually, this might be one question for you, but I noticed the Little Jerusalem marker on Upper King, and I'm aware of the great long history of KQBE in the city, but in these times and these years, how welcomed were Jews
question. Overall, Charleston has been a pretty welcoming space for the Jewish community. We believe the first kind of Jewish arrivals came in the late 17th century. There was a translator who was believed to be Jewish. He spoke indigenous languages and did some translating work, and he's the first documented person. The population then began to grow throughout the 18th century, and probably by the Revolution, there were maybe a couple of hundred Jews living in Charleston. But in the early 19th century, Charleston is the largest, it's the city with the largest Jewish population in the country. It surpasses New York, it surpasses Philadelphia. I know, it's amazing. So around 1830, I've seen different numbers, but about 800 Jews were living in Charleston at this time, and that was much larger than New York, which I think was around 600. That changes pretty quickly in the 1840s, 1850s. The population starts to decline. But overall, Jews found this place to be quite welcoming. They were able to establish synagogues. KKBE, of course, was the first. And then there, of course, is many stories of dissent and new synagogues being established. So it's a very, very rich and vibrant history. It's also a very rich mercantile history. So from the beginning, Jews were pretty active along King Street. And in the 20th century, much of Upper King Street was Jewish businesses. And if you walk along there today, there's certainly the marker that identifies it as Little Jerusalem, which is a bit controversial. A lot of longtime Jewish community members say, nobody actually called it that, so why are we calling it that now? But if you walk along Upper King Street, and what I've learned is you have to look up, you can often see the store names, the Jewish family names still on the buildings. And so if you're kind of looking straight as you walk, you miss it. But if you look up, you'll see it. Upper King. And so also, if you're interested, there is a digital project called Mapping Jewish Charleston. You can just type Mapping Jewish Charleston and you'll find it. And it has 4 different dates, 1790, 1833, 1910, and the present day. And you can essentially get a tour of Charleston Jewish locations during these different centuries. And you can take it and walk along King Street even if you'd like. Yeah.
The first waves were Sephardics, largely from the Caribbean. When did the Ashkenazi wave of the settlers come and overtake the command of the community?
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct. The first wave was Sephardi, so Jews who traced their heritage back to Spain, Portugal, and the Spanish-Portuguese expulsions in the late 15th century. Many of those Jews moved around the Caribbean, set up shop in, say, Amsterdam or England before trying their luck in the colonies. And then, as the politics of the colonies changed, many tried their luck in the new colonies in the what will become the United States. Ashkenazi Jews arrived here and there as individuals. We don't really think of larger waves of Ashkenazi Jews, which are Jews who trace their heritage to German-speaking lands, really until more of the 19th century. So we tend to periodize immigration with Sephardi being first, then the second 19th century wave up until the 1880s being more Central European, French Germanic, and then 1881 to 1924 is when 2.1 million East European Jews came to the United States. So, KKBE always followed the Sephardi tradition, but over time it certainly had more and more Ashkenazi Jews worshiping there, but still following the Sephardi tradition. When more immigrants come, then we start to see other synagogues established that follow more Eastern European rites.
I've heard that Reform Judaism has a lot of its roots here. Any theories about, why here, why in Charleston as opposed to other places?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm teaching it in my Southern Jewish History class this week. We're going to KKBE. So one theory that's been put forth by the historian Gary Zola is that what he did was he looked at the 6 oldest congregations in the United States, 3 in the South, 3 in the North. And the 3 southern ones were Richmond, Charleston, and Savannah. In the North, I think he looked at Philadelphia, New York, and Newport. And he asked, why is it that the 3 congregations in the South went Reform before the ones in the North? And it's a pretty marked distinction. And so his theory is that Jews living in the South, in places like Charleston, and Charleston is widely regarded as the birthplace of Reformed Judaism, although that's a little controversial, in the United States, I should say, is that the Jews living here, they were acclimated, wealthy, successful businessmen who wanted to worship in a way that reflected the kind of standing they had in the community. And they were paying attention to reform developments in cities in Germany, where many middle-class Jews were doing the same thing. They wanted Judaism and the way it's practiced to reflect the kind of middle-class dignified individuals that they were. And so the theory is that Jews felt a bit more pressure to acclimate in the South and worship like their Christian neighbors, and that's why Reform took hold in the South before the North.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us at St. Stephen's this evening. As I noted at the beginning of the talk, there is a reception. There's a ramp to the left of the building in the rear. Turn left into the courtyard and just go straight to the door just under the stairs there. Our next lecture for March will be on St. Patrick's Day, although the lecture has nothing to do with St. Patrick's Day. It will be March 17th at 5 p.m., and it will be a talk given by Dr. Jen Wilhelm, who is a science professor at the College of Charleston, a member of Grace Church Cathedral, and she'll be talking about the intersection for her of science and religion. So that will be our talk in March. Again, thank you so much for coming, and thank you to our speakers. Yeah.